Well, welcome to this section on time series evaluation and forecasting. And in this section, to get going, what we're going to do is see how to handle data that's given to you in file form. The file form I'm going to look at is CSV, or comma separated values files. And sooner or later, you're going to be dealing with data that somebody gives you. And so then it makes sense that you know how to open those files. I'm going to show you how to work with CSV files because that's the most common form you're probably going to see. We're going to see several ways of dealing with CSV files. And then it's important to note that even if you don't get data in a CSV file, the methods I'm going to show you will in fact be very similar to what you see here. So with that preamble, we'll jump into our notebook. And the first thing we're going to do is set up an environment here. So we're going to import the CSV module to deal with CSV files. And then later I'm going to plot some of the outputs. So I'm importing matplotlib's pyplot, and then I'm going to use this magic function, matplotlib inline, so we see the plots in the notebook. So we'll run that cell with Shift-Enter. And then once that's done, we're ready to go ahead and start getting our data. So I'm going to use the context manager with, and then the built-in function open. And then I just need to tell it what to open. Now the convention generally is that we'll set a variable to store the path to the file name in. But this file that I'm working with is in the same directory as the notebook. So all I really need to do is give it the file name. So we give it the file name, and then I'll just make a reference to this file. I'll call it file. And then we'll go ahead and start conducting some operations on that data that we're reading. So I'll set a variable called reader to store all the data. Next, I'll set a variable for the first row because it's a little different. It has labels in it. And we do that with next. Next basically tells it to skip the first row, but instead of skipping it, we're going to store it in a variable so we can use it later. Then I'm going to make a list to store the data in. With all that done, I'm going to make a simple loop to iterate over each row in the data file. And for each row, I'm just going to append it to our list. Okay, so once we're done reading the data, what we want to make sure we do is close the file. We don't want to waste a bunch of memory. So I'll go ahead and run that cell. And then now we have a variable data, and let's see what some of it looks like. So I'll just slice off the first 3 rows to get an idea. And so looking at the data, what we can see is some dates. It looks like they're going the start of each month. And then we get some price points. All right, so these price points are things like open, close, high, low for the S&P 500 going back to 1950. So a pretty sizable data set here. Okay, the second thing we can do is something that's pretty much the same, but the code is quite a bit more compact. So we start off the same way. We're going to use our context manager. We're going to set the variable for the reader. We're going to store the header. And then I'm going to, just so we see we get something different, I made up a new variable to store the data in. And then instead of making a loop, I can actually define it all in this one row, and this is called list comprehension. Okay, so after we comprehend our list, then once again, we're going to close our file. I'll go ahead and run this cell, and then just to see that we get the same thing, I'll once again slice off the first 3 rows. Once again, going back to 1950, we're getting various price points on the S&P 500. All right, so where we can see that it's maybe not that convenient to work with this data. It's a list of lists, and it is sort of represented 2-dimensionally, but it'd be very hard to do something like plot the ending price for each month. So oftentimes what we might do is convert the data. And the first conversion I'm going to show you is conversion to a NumPy array. And then I'm just going to set a variable And I'm going to pass in one of the previously read data sets. I'm going to store it in a NumPy array. With that done, we can take a look at the data. So what I did was look at everything in the essentially third position of the data set. All right, so we can see it's a little bit easier to deal with. It's kind of going to be hard to, again, plot this, but if I just want to say look at one of the entries, I can do that. All right, so there's one of our entries. It's the first row, or actually it's the second row because they're 0 indexed. All right, so if I want to see the first row, there it is. We can see it's a little bit easier to deal with, but maybe not exactly what we're interested in. First of all, if we wanted to do something like plot the closing price, we don't have any reference point for these various data points. But fortunately, we did store it in a variable earlier. So there they are. All right, so we can see this first data point corresponds with the date. So that's index 0, index 1, 2, 3, 4. That's the close. So if I wanted to plot the close, I could reference everything in the fourth column. So let's go ahead and try that. So just like that. So let's go ahead and try plotting it. And I'm going to have to convert the data in that column to a float. Right now, the data type is this Unicode. It's basically text data. So I need to tell NumPy that to treat this as a number. So I'm going to make it a float 32. Then I just reference my array, get all of the data points in the fourth column. You can see that works pretty well. And then the last method I'm going to show you is using the Pandas data frame. NumPy array is pretty convenient for lots of things, but the Pandas data frame makes working with data quite a bit simpler. So the first thing we're going to need to do is get Pandas. And then right here, Pandas has a convenience function called read CSV, and we just feed it in the file path. And then now when we want to look at, say, the first several rows, we feed in the name of the object, and then Pandas has a built-in head function, which will give us the first 5 rows. All right, so now we see something that we're pretty comfortable with. It looks almost like an Excel spreadsheet, but data is set up nicely in columns and rows, and now we can manipulate it if we want to replace this index over here with the dates. We can do that. If we want to plot this, instead of referring to a column number, now we can just refer to a column name. And since Pandas has integration with Matplotlib, I can just hang the plot function right off the end. Okay, so we get the same thing with a lot less code. Sometimes you may need to work with files in the way I outlined earlier, right? And then other times it's just going to be a lot easier to work with Pandas.